Welcome to the very first episode of our podcast series, Epic Family Podcast, the podcast of Epic Project. In this series, we will discuss everything you need to know about creating a podcast and the difference between a low budget and high budget podcast. I am Larissa, and with Martin
Hello, everyone.
and Lucas,
Hi, that's me.
we will host this podcast show.
Today, we will talk about different types of equipment, the software you'll need, and how to publish and promote your podcast. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned pro, there's something for everyone in this series. So let's begin.
So let's starting by defining what a podcast is. Could you help with us, Lucas?
Sure. A podcast is an audio file that's made available on the internet for people to listen to it. It's similar to a radio show, but it's available on demand, which means you can listen to it whenever you want. There are also podcast formats that incorporate visual elements such as images and videos. These types of podcasts are often referred to as enhanced or video podcasts. Briefly, enhanced podcasts can include synchronized images or slideshows that accompany the audio content. These images can be displayed on podcast players or devices that support the enhanced podcast format. This can be useful, for example, for educational or informational podcasts that benefit from visual aids. That while enhanced and video podcasts can provide a more immersive and visually engaging experience, they may require specific hosting platforms or players that support the inclusion of visual elements. Additionally, the ability to display images and videos may vary depending on the podcast player or platform used by listeners. But do you know the best part? You can create your podcast about any topic you like.
Do you mean as Epic Project develops intra-family communication tools? This could be a topic for a podcast?
Sure, it could be, in fact, an interesting topic. Look, let's list some types of podcasts so our listeners can also get an idea of the variety. And some examples. The first one is News and Current Affairs. This podcast focus on delivering the latest news, analysis, and discussions on current events, politics, and social issues. Some examples include BBC Global News Podcast, The Daily by the New York Times, and The Guardian's Today in Focus. Also, there are true crime podcasts that delve into real-life criminal cases, investigations, and mysteries. They often feature storytelling, interviews, and in-depth analysis. Popular examples include Serial, Criminal, and My Favorite Murder. Another type are history podcasts. They explore various historical periods, events, and figures, offering informative and entertaining narratives, like the podcast Hardcore History with Dan Carlin, the podcast Revolutions, and the British History Podcast. And of course, there are comedy podcasts that feature comedic hosts and guests engaging in humorous conversations, sketches, and storytelling. One notable example is the podcast The Joe Rogan Experience. Another regular topic of podcasts is science and technology. This kind delves into scientific discoveries, technological advancements, and discussions on topics like space, medicine, and artificial intelligence. The Infinite Monkey Cage, Science versus and Radio Lab are some examples. And then we have personal development and self-improvement podcasts. They provide insights, advice, and inspiration for personal growth, mental health, and overall well-being. Some popular examples include the Tony Robbins podcast, the School of Greatness, and the Happiness Lab. Another kind are storytelling podcasts. They feature captivating narratives, often in the form of serialized fiction or non-fiction storytelling. Notable examples include The Moth, S-Town, and Criminal. Music and culture are also good topic for podcasts. This kind explores music genres, artists, and cultural phenomena, offering discussions, interviews, and music recommendations. Examples: Song Exploder, Dissect, and Kermode and Mayo's Film Review. Business podcasts, on the other hand, focus on topics like startups, entrepreneurship, leadership, and success stories. Some examples that I remember now are How I Built This, The Tim Ferriss Show, and the Smart Passive Income Online Business and Blogging Podcast. And last but not least, I present to you the Lifestyle and Wellness Podcast. They cover various aspects of lifestyle, including health, fitness, relationships, and parenting. Just like the Life Coach School podcast, the Joe Wicks podcast, and the Goop podcast. Whew.
And of course, these are just some example of podcast topics, right?
Yes, they are.
But what make a good podcast?
Maybe I can help in this one. Maybe I can help you and our listeners.
Go on, please.
Yeah. So, what a good podcast is: engaging, informative, entertaining, and keeps the audience hooked. It has to be something, special to keep them listening or to keep them wanting to listen to you more.
How do you do that?
So, keeping the audience hooked in a podcast requires engaging content and effective presentation. Here are some tips to help you keep your audience engaged if you want to start a podcast. So, first one is to start with a strong hook. How? Begin your podcast with an attention-grabbing introduction that piques the listener's curiosity. Pose a thought-provoking question. Like, you can start the podcast with a question that keeps the listeners attached to the podcast. They want to listen to the end so they can have the answers for this question. Or tease an exciting topic to immediately captivate your audience. For example, if in a hypothetical case you have a podcast on parenting advice and an episode on constant cell phone use, why not start an episode with an anecdote that represents a common situation about this topic? Well, next one, develop a clear structure. Organize your podcast in a logical and structured manner. Outline the main points or segments of your episode beforehand and clearly communicate them to your audience. This helps listeners anticipate what's coming next and stay engaged throughout. An interesting tip is to be enthusiastic and authentic. Your passion and enthusiasm for the subject matter should shine through your voice. You have to be really deeper into the thing that you're explaining to the listeners. Speak with energy, authenticity to create an engaging and relatable experience for your listeners. Avoid sounding monotone, like you have to keep this voice. No, try to be more engaging with your sound, with your voice. This is not cool. Nobody will like to hear this monotonic voice.
Yeah.
Instead, imagine that you're having a conversation with your audiences. Rather than delivering a monologue, use a conversational language. Engage in back and forth discussion with the people that you have, with the hosts that you have. And involve your listeners by addressing them directly or encouraging participation through social media or email. So during the episode, you can ask a question and request that the audiences, the listeners, respond to this question in the comments or send you an email and so on. In the episode, you can tell compelling stories. Humans are naturally drawn to stories. Incorporate engaging narratives, personal experiences, and anecdotes that illustrate your points or entertain your audiences. Stories help create an emotional connection and keeps listeners invested. This is really important. The next one, use varied and engaging content formats. Mix up the content formats within your podcasts. Include interviews, guest appearances, roundtable discussions, solo episodes that you just one will be doing the episode, will host the episode, or even listener question and answer segments. So you can make a whole episode about the questions that you gave to the audience or they gave to you, and then you can answer and question the audiences. This adds variety and keeps the podcast fresh and interesting. Bringing up the examples of constant cell phone use One could take it from surveying how many parents face this problem with their children to inviting an expert who can help figure out how to deal with this situation. So you can think about this. If you have a problem, you want to discuss a problem to your audiences, you can also invite an expert about this problem. If you don't have a solution for this, but you can invite definitely someone who's an expert. Another tip that I can give you is to keep your podcast concise and focused. Respect your listeners' time by keeping your podcast episodes concise and focused. Trim unnecessary tangents and ensure your content stays on track. So if you think that this part would not be suitable for the audiences or unnecessary, you can just remove it so you can make the episode shorter to be able to fit the audience's need if they want to listen to something shorter. Consider breaking down complex topics into shorter series or episodes to maintain the attention of the audiences. Now, about using engaging language and storytelling techniques, incorporate the descriptive language, vivid imagery, and storytelling techniques to paint a picture in the minds of your listeners. Make your content relatable, intriguing, and emotionally resonant. In the story of the children's constant cell phone use, tell a story, true or maybe even fictional, it doesn't matter, in which you show the parents' difficulty in confronting their children because of this problem, as in a role play form, for an example.
Nice.
Add a production value. Enhance the production quality of your podcast by using high quality audio equipment, clear sound editing, and adding appropriate music or sound effects when necessary, according to the theme or the topic that you will talk about, so it would be fitting, it would be going smoothly. A well-produced podcast can elevate the overall listening experience and engage your audience. The last one but not least, also, and to include the series of tips, I suggest you encourage listeners' interaction, create opportunities for your audience to engage, ask for feedback, encourage them to share their thoughts and questions, and to respond to comments or messages. Don't leave them hanged. So whenever someone asks you a question or comment, even if it's not really important, but the engagement with your audience is what keeps them attached to your podcasts. This fosters a sense of community and connection, making listeners feel more invested into your podcast.
Well, really nice, thank you. And if I can add something, I would say that the podcast should be well produced and easy to listen to. Good podcasts usually have a specific niche or topic that they focus on. So if you may, I can present some examples that should help you who wants to make a podcast inside of the big topic of families. Like, a big topic is personal development podcasts, providing guidance, advice, and inspiration for personal growth, self-improvement, and achieving success. Another topic, health and wellness podcasts, covering topics related to physical and mental well-being, including fitness, nutrition, mindfulness, and self-care. Another one, history and culture podcasts, diving into historical events, cultural traditions, and significant moments from different eras and regions. This one is very nice to Epic Family Podcast, parenting and family podcasts, offering advice, tips, and discussions on parenting, child rearing, family dynamics, and relationships. And a last one, travel and adventure podcasts. You can make podcasts about exploring destinations, sharing travel stories, tips, and advice for adventure seekers, wanderers, and globetrotters.
Oh, interesting. So, just to summarize it for our listeners, someone who wants to create a podcast must choose a topic of them for their podcast. And this will depend on the interest and what they want to talk about. It is also important to remember to choose a topic that you are passionate about and will keep your audience engaged.
Yeah, and one tip to help you choose the topic or the theme for your podcast is to research what already exists. So you wouldn't make something that, is repeated by many podcasts. Take a look at the podcast aggregator platforms such as Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts, and see what is being produced on that topic or theme. For example, these platforms are the places where you will find almost all the podcasts that exist online.
Now, what do you think if we slightly change the subject?
What do you have in mind?
Why not talk about the equipment, what you need to make a podcast?
Of course. Okay, in general, you'll need a microphone, obviously, a headphone to keep you to help you monitor your audio while recording and editing, a pop filter, which is a screen that attached to your microphone and help reduce sounds, when you pronounce the P and B, and you need a boom arm, which can hold the microphone, or a mic stand, and you need a shock mount. This is where you put your microphone into this shock mount that attached to the microphone to help reduce the shaking sounds and so on. You need an audio interface to convert the analog signal from your microphone into a digital signal that can be recorded into your computer. It provides better sound quality and control over audio levels. Also consider adding basing acoustic treatments to recording space to minimize echo and unwanted background noise. This can include foam panels, bass traps, or portable isolation shields. And finally, a recording and editing software. You can choose a recording software like Audacity, which is free, or Adobe Audition, which is to pay for a subscription, to record this audio and to be able to edit it using these softwares. These softwares allows you to edit, enhance, and mix your recordings, add music, sound effects, or remove background noises.
Wow, this seems a lot. So, if one of your listeners want to be in a podcast, do they have to own all this stuff?
Well, no. The short answer is no. All this equipment I mentioned is certainly useful to produce a podcast of a great technical quality. But I have another answer that might surprise you. It's relatively simple. So, you don't need to break the bank to start a podcast. With a good quality microphone and a laptop or computer, it's possible to record a podcast. There are plenty of affordable microphones available that can produce great sound quality. You can even use your smartphone. You can use, if you have an iPhone, if you have an Android phone, you can use that to record the podcast if you are really tight on budget.
That sounds great.
Yeah, so a great low budget option for a microphone is called Blue Snowball microphone. It's easy to use, has a great sound quality. You can plug it into your computer or laptop directly and you're ready to go.
Oh yeah. And did you say that even a smartphone's microphone could work well?
Yeah, so recently the smartphones that has been produced are really decent. They have decent microphones built in. And there are plenty of apps that you can use to record and edit your audio right from the phone.
And actually, I use it to do this. I did podcast using my cell phone.
Yeah, it's not the best option, definitely, but it will do the job. If you're just starting and you don't have that much of a budget, you can do it right with your phone.
Yeah, I really like this case. Earlier you mentioned it, some audio recording and editing software. What do you mean?
There are many options available from free softwares like Audacity and also GarageBand if you own a MacBook or like anything that runs Mac OS. To paid softwares like Adobe Audition. There are plenty of softwares that are paid. There are so many differences regarding the functions or the tools that you can use. It's important to choose a software that's easy to use and suits your needs. If you are a beginner, if you want to start from scratch, it's important to choose a software that's easy.
Easy to use, so they could easily be used by anyone?
Everything can be used by anyone, but we will give a complete tutorial in the later episode.
Nice.
Yeah.
At this point, someone may be thinking whether it's worthwhile to do a low budget podcast. Well, don't worry. There are plenty of successful podcasts that started with minimal equipment. For example, my favorite Murder that I mentioned before is a true crime podcast that started with just two hosts and a microphone. Another one, The Daily, is a news podcast that's produced by the New York Times and it's recorded using a smartphone.
Yeah, there you go. But if you have a bigger budget, of course, you can invest in a higher quality equipment. So you can get a professional microphone, you can have a mixer or like an audio interface, you can have a recording software that is paid like Adobe Audition. That can make a huge difference in the quality of your podcast.
And what you recommend in this case?
If you have the budget, you can buy a microphone that is called Shure SM7B, but there are like more models. This is one of the most popular options for professional podcasters. It has a great sound quality, has a built-in pop filter that we talked earlier about, and it's perfect for recording voiceovers, interviews, the podcast in general. But if you're looking for a more portable option, because this microphone Shure is a little bit bigger. If you're looking for a portable option, there is the Zoom H6, which is a recorder. It's not a microphone, but it's a recorder. It's a great choice. It's a handheld recorder that can record up to 6 tracks at once. The H6, as I said, it's not a dedicated mixer. It's not a dedicated microphone as well, but it does provide some mixing capabilities, making it versatile tool for recording podcasts and other audio content, which is great for recording multiple guests or sound effects.
Well, some of the most successful podcasts in the world use high quality equipment. Serial is a true crime podcast that's recorded using high-end microphones and recording equipment.
So, how to choose?
Well, it depends on your needs and your budget. If you're just starting out and don't have a lot of money to invest, a low-budget setup is an excellent place to start. However, if you're serious about creating a high-quality podcast, a high-budget setup will undoubtedly provide better results.
Sure.
To give you an idea of what each setup can produce, let's listen now. This part is recorded by a cell phone. A smartphone is recording this audio clip.
So now we're recording with a smartphone, so you can hear the difference between the professional mic that we used earlier and the smartphone.
As you can hear, the audio quality isn't perfect, but it's still quite good. The host's voice is clear and easy to understand, and the overall sound is free from any background noise.
So, once you have recorded and edited the podcast, I think it's time to publish it.
And also register it.
Yes.
But why should you register your podcast?
Yeah, because registering your podcast is important because it gives you the ownership of your content and helps protect it from being copied or stolen. Because it's gonna be on the internet, so anybody can go download your podcast, claim that it's his podcast, where he can copy the same topic that you're talking about, the same text, everything. So it's better to register it. In other words, you own the copyright on your podcast. By registering your podcast, you can also access valuable analytics that will help you track your audience and improve your content. For example, listener demographics. You may be able to understand the age, gender, location, and interest of your audience, and this can help you tailor your content to their preferences. So, for example, if you're making a podcast that is about a topic that is related to teenagers, so you can know the age or the gender that your audiences are, and then you can make better topics, you can choose better words, you can tailor this content to meet their preferences. You can also see the listeners' engagement, the tracking metrics like average listening duration, episode downloads, and subscriber growth can indicate how engaged your audience is with your podcast. You can see whether your audience is listening to your podcast until the end or halfway through the episode, like this, because you would know that probably if it's an episode that the duration is like 30 minutes and the audiences are listening to 10 or 15 minutes, then it means that you can make a shorter episode that can So the audiences can
Yeah,
listen to the full episode.
makes sense.
The listener feedback. You can actively seek and analyze listeners' feedback, such as reviews, comments, and surveys that can provide valuable insights into what your audience like and dislike. The social media interaction is really important because everything happens on the social media now. Monitoring likes, shares, comments on social media platforms can help you gauge audience sentiment and identify popular topics or episodes. So if you made like 5 or 10 episodes, you can see on the social media that there is one or two that has more likes, the most likes, or the most comments. This can identify that this topic you talked about is really interesting for the audiences. So you can make something that follows or like continue the same topic and so on.
Yeah.
The conversion rate, which is tracking conversions from listeners to website visitors. So if, for example, if you have a website, you have a newsletter, you have like a website to sell merchandise and so on, you can see that, okay, there are 100 audiences that are listening to your podcast, and from these 100 there are 2 who went to the website. So this is the conversion rate. How many from the audiences went to the website or went to subscribe to this newsletter that you have and so on. So this is the conversion rate.
Oh, I love data. It's everything to understand our public and evaluate our podcast. Okay, it's important to register your podcast in order to also have some contact with the audience in an official way, we can say. But how can my podcast arrive to the audience? Why and how to publish it?
That's an interesting question. It's the most important question of this podcast. To publish a podcast, you must first host it on a server and then index it in the distribution services. I will explain what these two things mean, but first it is important to remember that a podcast is an audio file that is available on the internet for download to computers and mobile devices. The technology used to distribute podcasts is the RSS feed. Don't worry, the RSS feed gives the podcast its subscription feature, making it unnecessary to go to the site or the servers where the file is hosted. But on platforms like Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts at the end, you will find that all of this is quite automatic from a podcaster's point of view.
Yeah, the most important thing about publishing your podcast is that it will help you reach a wider audience and gain more listeners. It basically can be found all over the world. Some hosting platforms for podcasts are Anchor, also known as Spotify for podcasters, Buzzsprout, and Podbean. These platforms will also help you distribute your podcast to various platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, with the RSS feed technology. This kind of platform is generally free to use. You can download Spotify and use it freely. They do not store the files, but are the main channels for disseminating podcasts. The hosting platforms, on the other hand, Buzzsprout, Podbean, Anchor, are those that store the files. It is on the hosting platforms that the management happens, comprising production, editing, publishing, and scheduling, monetization, statistics reports, including use of the distribution platforms. It usually has a very intuitive user interface in order to help anyone publishing their own podcast. But don't worry, we will go into more detail about this argument in later episodes of this series.
Okay, just to see if it's right as summary. You host your podcast in some platform like Anchor, publish your episode there, and through the RSS feed technology, that is an automatic process inside the hosting platform, your podcast reaches your audience through another kind of platform, that is the distribution platforms like Google Podcasts. And these platforms will be the main channel through which the audience mostly come to your podcast, without being necessary to go to the website where your podcast is originally hosted.
Yeah, that's right. Nice summary. And also to conclude, now the podcast is live. It's time to promote it. You can promote your podcast on social media by reaching out to other podcasts in your niche, or and by asking your listeners to share your podcast with their friends. But this point will also be further detailed in the fourth episode of Epic Family Podcasts.
We arrive at the end of our first Epic Family Podcast episode. To sum up, creating a podcast takes time and effort, but it can be a rewarding experience. Focus on creating engaging content, invest in a good quality equipment and software, and register and publish your podcast to reach a wider audience. Remember, podcast is a fun and engaging way to share your ideas and interests with others. It's a way of spreading your ideas, your work, and your passions so that other people who might be interested in the same arguments as you can listen and who knows, share what you produce. That's for today's episode of Epic Family Podcast. We hope you found this episode helpful and informative. Join us next time and we discuss how to plan and prepare your podcast. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to reach out on social media. Epic Family Podcast is a project founded by Erasmus Plus and Movetia. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.